Hello everyone, welcome back to my C# programming language video series. Before moving to the next chapter, please make sure to subscribe me and like this video. In this chapter, let's take a look on functions that are using in programming. To have more deeper understanding about function, let's learn about function according to this topic. First, let's learn how to declare a function and what are static functions, what are the access modifiers used in programming, and return types and return values using in functions, and parameters and arguments used in function, what are default parameters and how to do method overloading, and finally let's take a look on lambda expressions. First, let's see what is a function. Function is a block of code which can perform a specific task. We can input values to the function and get some output from it. Also, functions are reusable. Once we define a function to do some specific task, we can use it whenever we want it. It allows us to reduce the number of codes writing to do the same task for many times. When considering a function, the basic structure of a function is: first, we have to define the type of the access modifier, and then the return type of the output of this function, then the name of the function, then add brackets. Inside this bracket, you can use parameters. When declaring a parameter, you have to mention the data type of the parameter and then parameter name. Add curly brackets and close it. Inside these curly brackets, you can write the code to execute this function. And finally, we have to define the return data value of the function. For that, you have to write this return keyword and then the value that you want to give as output. This return value is optional. If you are not returning any value from this function, you don't want to add this statement. One thing you should consider is when you are returning a value, the returning data type you have mentioned in here should be same of the data type of the value that you are returning in here. So this is the basic structure of functions. When you are adding some function to a program, you have to add it inside this internal class or any other class that you have defined. So let's create our first function. As this is the main function of our program, we have to define the function that we are going to create outside of this function. So let's create a function within this class program and outside from this main class. Let's see how to declare the function. First, let's type the access modifier. We'll learn about access modifier in the next topic. So, and the return type of this function, let's use void and the function name. Let's define our function name as calculate and then open brackets. Inside this bracket, we can define any parameters if you want. At this moment, I am not using any parameters, and then I add curly brackets and then I type a console.write line statement, and inside this, let's write this is our first function. As I have used the return type as void, it means we are not returning any value from this function. So I haven't used the return statement inside this function. So this is the basic way how to write a function. So if you want to execute this code within this function, you have to call this function by its name from this main function. For that, let's type calculate and add brackets and then a semicolon. As we haven't defined any parameters inside this bracket, we have to keep this bracket empty. If this function have any parameter, you have to pass it from here. And then we add this to keep our console open. So let's run this application and see what will be the output. So here you can see it have printed this is our first function, which means when we are executing the coding, first it will run this main function. Inside this main function we have called the function calculate. So it called this function and it executes the code inside this function. As this statement is inside this function, it executes and prints the output here. So that's how to declare a function basically and call it from our executing program. Let's go to the topic of this static function. So now let's take a look on static functions. In this function that I have declared, the access modifier I have used is static. As our main function is a static function and the function that we created newly is also inside this same class, we have to define this as a static function. When you are declaring a function with the access modifier static, that means you don't want to create an object for the class which function exit. Instead of creating an object, you can directly call the function by its name. In the next chapter, we are learning about object-oriented programming, and in that chapter, we learn about the classes and how to use function inside class. So until that, it's enough you to know that we are using this access modifier static on our function to call it directly instead of creating an object to the class. Now let's take a quick look on access modifiers. When talking about access modifiers, basically there are 4 types of access modifiers. They are public, private, protected, and static. Already we have a simple look on what is static, and as we have to mention the access modifier of the function when declaring a function, you can use one of these types. In the example we have learned, we have used static, and other than static there are 3 types called public, private, and protected. As I have mentioned before, in widely we use functions inside classes. If we have defined a function with public access modifier, it means that the function inside the class can be accessed by anyone from any class. If we declare a function with the access modifier private, it means the function within the class only can access within that class. If we use the access modifier protected when declaring a function, that means we can access that function from the same class and the inherited class. So in this chapter, it's enough to have a simple idea on what are access modifiers and its type when declaring function. Let's look more on these access modifiers and how the functions are accessible when using different types of access modifier in the object-oriented chapter. Now let's learn about the return types and return values of functions. As I have explained before, I have used the return type of this function as void. When you are using a return type as void, it means that function is not returning any value. If you have any return value from the function, you have to return that value at the end of the function. Now let's see how to return a value from a function. So let's assume I have an integer value called number inside this function and its value is 10. I want to get the value of this variable number by calling this function. In that case, we can return this variable from this function as return and the name of the variable that you want to return. You can see here it's showing an error in this return keyword. The reason for that is we have used the return type of this function as void, and now we are returning a value with the data type integer. As I have explained before, when you are returning some variable from a function, the return type you have declaring and the data type of the returning value should be same. So in here it's not same because the returning variable data type is integer and the return type of this function is void. So if you want to return this number variable, you have to declare the return type of the function as int. So now you can see the error has gone because now the returning variable data type and the function data type are same. Now you can see you have called this function and this function is returning the variable number. So when you are calling this function, you have to define a variable to get the value returning from this function. As the returning value of this function is an integer data type, I am defining another integer variable called num and it's equal to the function calculate. Here what I have done is I have called this function named calculate, and once we are calling this function, it's returning us the variable number. We should have a variable to catch this function. Then let's print this variable num. Now let's run this application. And here you can see it has printed the statement this is our first function. That is because we have called this function and it's executing, and then finally it's returning the variable to this integer variable num. At the last we have printed it on the console. So this number 10 is the value we obtained from the function calculate. Other than this integer data type, you can return any type of data from a function. You can return variables with any type of data like string, integer, double, boolean, list, arrays, or any other data structure. Let's see another example. And here I am defining another variable called number 2 and assign its value as number 20. And now I want to return the sum of these two variables from this function. For that, we can return the sum of these two variables like return number plus number 2. And now let's see what will be the output. Now here the return value from the function is 30. That's because we are returning the value as number plus number 2, which means we can get the sum of these two numbers and it's returning as function output. Let's check another example. Now let's calculate the sum of these two variables and assign into a new variable called sum. For that, here I have declared a new variable called sum, and let's take its value as num equal number 2. And I'm declaring another string variable as a string value, and I am writing its value as total of numbers equal, and then I add this variable sum to this string variable, and then I am returning this variable string. So now again it's showing an error as though we are trying to return a string variable, but the returning type of this function is integer, so I am changing it again as string. So now when we are calling this function calculate, it's showing an error because it returns an string value and we are assigning it here into an integer value. So we are change its data type also, and let's run this and check the output. Here you can see it's showing total of number equal to 30. So that's because here it's returning an string variable and we have assigned it to this number variable and we have printed it. So that's how the return value and the return types of functions are working. Now let's take a look on the parameters and the arguments using in function. So now I am declaring a new function called static and the integer data type as the return data type, and the function name is total, and then I have added brackets and then curly brackets. As the return type of this function is int, I am returning some integer value as 0, and here I'll call this function as total. Here I have declared a basic function. Now let's see how to use parameters and arguments. As I mentioned in the beginning, we can pass data as inputs to functions. So let's assume you want to create a function which you can pass some integer values to the function, and within that function you want to calculate the total value of them and return the total of it as the output. So this is the function. We named it as total, and assume we want to pass two integer values to this total function to calculate its total. So when we are calling this function, we can pass the values as 10 and 20. Here I have passed two integer values to this function total, and here you can see it's showing an error because in this function you have declared there's no parameters we have defined to get these values we are passing. As these both are integers, we have to define two parameters. When you are defining a parameter, you have to add its data type and then the parameter name. So let's define its data type as int and the parameter name as num1. As there is another value we have passed, let's define one more parameter as int and its parameter name is num2. So now the error has gone because we are passing two values to the function, and now there are two parameters to obtain the values passing. So this is what we are called parameter in function, and when we are calling this function, we are passing some values. The values that we are passing we call as arguments. When you are passing arguments to a function, you must initialize the parameters to obtain that arguments. The number of arguments have defined when you are calling the function should be equal to the number of parameters in the function where you have declared. Now let's calculate the sum of these two parameters and assign it to the variable sum as integer sum, and its value equal to num1 plus num2. And instead of this 0, let's return the variable sum as the output of this function, and let's add a console.writeLine, and then we will take this function inside this and remove the semicolon. Now let's see what is the output. Here you can see it gives the output as 30 because we are passing the arguments 10 and 20 to the function and they are assigned to the parameter num1 and num2, and inside this function we have calculate its total into the variable sum and we have returned it. So that's how you get this value 30 from this function total. Basically this is how we can use parameters and arguments. Instead of integer, we can use any other type of as parameters. Let's take a look on another example. Here let's pass some value as total is equal. And now here we have two integer arguments and one string arguments. So the first two parameters we have defined in this function should be integer, and then we have to again define a parameter with string data type, and let's define its parameter name as value. Let's return the parameter value from this function instead of this integer variable sum. So let's change the returning type as string, and the returning value is parameter value plus sum. Now let's see the output again, and here it prints the total is 30. Now let's take a look on what are default parameters. Let's change this into as string result as string result equal this, and then let's print the result inside this console.writeLine. The purpose of using parameter as inputs of a function is when you are reusing the function several times, the parameter values can be different from each other. So that's why we are using parameters instead of using constant values. Assume you are calling this function total several times. Let's copy this, and then let's change the variable names as result 1, 2, 3 and 4, and let's change these values also. But think you don't want to pass this argument to this parameter in each time, which means you are not passing an argument to this value parameter. That means this value parameter will not get value when calling the functions every time. So in that kind of situations, we can define a default value for this as total is equal. Now this value parameter have a default value as this. So in each time when you are calling this function, you don't want to pass argument for this value parameter. If you want, you can pass any value, or you cannot use any value because there is a default value. Now let's change this into total can be like, and then here we change this into total must be. Here you can see in the first time that we are calling this function, we are passing arguments for all these three parameters, but in the second time we have only passed arguments for this parameter 1 and 2, and for this third parameter we haven't passed anything. And in the third call for this function, we have sent arguments for all these three parameters, and again in the fourth call we have only passed two arguments. Let's print the output of these as result 2, 3 and 4. And now let's run this application. Here you can see our outputs, as the output of result 1 is total can be like 30. As the return value of this function, we have used the parameter value and the variable sum. So the value of the parameter value is total can be like 30. This is what we have passed as argument to this function when we are calling it. Even there's a default value for this parameter, it has taken the argument passed when calling the function. In the result 2, the output is total is equal 68. Here we haven't passed any argument for this value parameter, so it has taken the value of it as the default value. So here it prints as total is equal, which is the default value of this parameter. In the third one, which is result 3, the output is total must be 92. As we have passed an argument for the parameter value when calling the function, it takes the parameter values as this argument value instead of the default one. And in the last one, which is result 4, again we haven't passed any argument for this parameter, so it takes the default value as its value. So what I want to explain you from this example is, default parameters are the parameters which has a default value. When a parameter has a default value, you don't want to pass an argument for it each and every time you are calling it. If you are passing an argument for that parameter, the parameter takes its value as the argument value. If you are not passing any argument for that parameter, it takes its default value as the parameter value. So that's the general idea of default parameters. Now let's take a look on function overloading. The basic idea of function overloading is using the same function name on several functions within the same class with different parameter values and return types on each function. So again, let's create a function as static and the return type as void and the function name as calculate, and it has two parameters as int num1 and int num2. And let's print the values of this as console.writeLine num1 plus num2. So this is a basic function. The concept of function overloading is having several functions with the same name but with different types of parameters, which means we can use this function again with the same name, but it's showing an error because there's no difference between the parameters of these two functions. So let's change this int into double, and now the error is missing. This is what we call function overloading, which means we have two functions with the same name but its parameters are different from each. Likewise, we can add another function with the same name and we can differentiate this function from others by defining another parameter called num3. So that's the idea of function overloading, and here you can call each function as calculate. Let's call the first function. It has two integer parameters, so the arguments that we are passing should be integer values. And now let's call the second function. In the second function, its first parameter type is double and the second one is integer. So the first argument we are passing should be a double value and then it should be a integer value. Let's call our third function. In this function there are three variables with integer data type, so we are passing three arguments which are integer values. Let's change this into num3 plus. So let's run this again, and here you can see The output of the first function is 30 and the second one is 40.5, and in the third one the output is 60. In here I have used parameters with double and integer data type, and I have used only a simple code block as console.writeLine. Even I have used the same code block inside this function. You can define different code block to execute in each function. Let's take a look on lambda expressions. Lambda expressions also a function type which we used in simple operations. Instead of using separate named functions within classes, we can use lambda expressions to do small operations. We can use a lambda function even inside a function. The basic structure of lambda function is brackets. Inside these brackets, the parameter list, and then the arrow, and then the expression. From this arrow, it indicates that the parameter from this parameter list goes to this expression. So let's see an example of lambda expression. Type the keyword fun and this bracket. Inside this bracket, you can define the data type of the parameter that you input to this function and the data type of the value that returns from this function. In here, I define two integers, as the input value for this function is also integer data type and the output also an integer data type, and then define a name and equal mark, and then this is the name of our function, and let's define our lambda expression as x, and this value of x goes as x into x. This is our lambda expression. The expression name is square, and here it inputs an integer value and outputs an integer value. So let's print this like console.writeLine, and inside this define the function name square and add brackets. Inside this bracket pass the value 5. Now let's run this and see. It prints the value as 25, which is we pass the argument 5 as this x, and it goes as x into x, which means 5 into 5 is 25. In here we have passed only one parameter. Even like other functions, we can pass multiple parameters to lambda functions. When you are passing multiple parameters, you have to define the type of the parameter that you are passing in here. Now let's pass again an integer value. So the parameter data type is int. Instead of this, we can write it as x, comma and y. Then we can change this expression and x into y, and let's pass another value. As there are two parameters, you have to add brackets around this. So now let's print this. The output value is 50, as we are passing the argument 5 and 10 to this function, and x takes the value 5 and y takes the value 10. So these are the parameters, and these parameters go inside this expression, and they multiply them as x into y and return the output of this expression as 5 into 10 is 50. Other than using this in a one line, you can just add multiple line code block. Like, you can just remove this expression, and instead of this you can add curly brackets, and then make sure to add semicolon at the last of this expression. And inside this code block you can add any command that you want to execute. So here let's type as multi two numbers, and here we have to return some value as we have defined a return value, return x into y. Let's change this function name into square 2. So now let's run this again, and here you can see it prints multiplying two numbers and the value 50 as it returns the value 50. Some important usage of this lambda function is we can use these lambda functions with arrays. By using lambda functions with arrays, we can loop through each element of the array using this lambda function instead of creating loops with multiple code lines. So let's define an array as int, array name as numbers, and let's define values inside the array as 7, 8, and 9. Let's close this array. So assume you want to get only the even numbers from this array. For that, you can initialize a new variable called even numbers, and you can use lambda function to find the even numbers which are in this array number. For that, let's type the name of our variable array, and then we want to find even values. A way how we can find whether a number is even or odd is check the modulation of this number is equal to 0. For that, let's type where and add brackets. Inside this bracket, now let's use the lambda expression. Let's type n, which is our parameter, and then arrow, and then the expression as check the modulation of n is equal to 0. This is our lambda expression that we used with this array. With the use of the function where, it loops through each element of this array numbers, and each element of this array will pass to this lambda expression as n is the parameter, and this arrow identifies this parameter values goes into this expression, and in this expression it checks if the modulation of the element is equal to 0. If it's equal to 0, then it passes that element to this even variable. After looping through all the elements of this array, it identifies the even numbers of this array and passes them to this variable even number as an array. To check what are the values inside this array, we can use let's run this and check. Here you can see it printed 2, 4, 6, 8, which are the even numbers in this array. So that's all about lambda expressions. Up to now in this chapter, we have learned about these concepts, which gives you a broad understanding about what are functions and how to use it and what are the attributes of the function. So I hope now you have a better understanding about functions, and here's a reminder to subscribe me and like this video, and let's meet again with the next chapter.